We're going to pick up here in Genesis chapter 6, and I don't expect us to get too far because of the topic we have at hand. We've got a lot to go over in Genesis chapter 6, as you know. I'm sure that we're going to be dealing with uh, Noah's flood, the condition of the world prior to the Noah's flood, basically right here at this point in time that we're dealing with. And we're going to be dealing with the sons of God issue. Are they angels? Are they men? Or are they the result of angels, I should say? And so, well, no, the sons of God being the angels, but you follow my point. So there's going to be a lot to go through. And I'll be honest with you, I'll be surprised if we even have a chance to get to the discussion of the sons of God. I know that some of you probably are really looking forward to that, but there's just so much in these first few verses that just talking about the sons of God, we can't do that in 10 minutes. And I just don't see it. If we get a chance, we'll certainly do that. We'll talk about that tonight, but I don't expect that we will. We will, like I said, spend quite a bit of time dealing with the situation of mankind, the situation of Earth at this point in time. So we'll go ahead and jump right in here and pick up at Genesis chapter 6. We'll look at verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all that which they chose." And so we're going to start really just dealing with these two verses right here. And so what we're seeing here is it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth. You need to understand that, again, reading the Bible in the first 6 chapters here, it may take us an hour to get this far in reading it. It might take us, I don't know when we started the actual Genesis study. It's been a while now. It may take months to get to this point in a Bible study, but the amount of time that has passed since Adam has been created is 1,656 years. And you might ask, how is it that you can tell that? And the reason you can tell that is based upon the genealogies, the generations of Noah. And so you can look at each of the timelines. So like Adam, according to Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, Adam became the father of Seth at 130 years old. And so we know we've already gone 130 years. And then Seth became the father of Enosh at 105 years, according to verse 6 of Genesis 5. So 130 plus 105, we get 235. And then you continue to work your way down. And when you get to when Lamech became the father of Noah at 182 years old, according to verse 28 of Genesis 5, we've gone through 1,056 years. And so when the flood started, when Noah was 600 years old, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 6, so 600 plus 1,056 gives us the time of the flood from the day of Adam's creation to be 1,656 years. And so that's how much you can trust your Bible. Is it's that specific. We know how many years it's been up to this point. And so at this point in time, in 1,656 years, when it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth," most people, I think, approach the scriptures of Genesis chapter 6 and think of, what is there, a few hundred people? But really, if you really look at the growth rate, and I went and calculated this based upon different scientific breakdowns of the growth rate. In the year 2000, the growth rate was 0.012, so basically 1.2%. And so in the year 2000, if you use that growth rate from Adam for 1,656 years, you would have roughly 750 million people at this point. A lot of people. And given the fact that you have long lifespans prior to the flood, the growth rate could have actually been much higher than 0.012. In other words, more than 1.2%. And if you simply add, make it from 1.2% to 1.3%, based on what I'm reading, that would change the population from 750 million to 4 billion people at the time of the flood. And so, yeah, I would say that verse 1 here, it came to pass when men began to multiply, they certainly were multiplying. And so we would have quite a few men. And so this is important to understand as we consider why God is going to judge the earth, because it's not like there's just 500 people that are doing some bad things. It's not like there's just 1,000 people. There's almost certainly roughly a billion people. And as we're going to see that the way that their mindset is, their actions are, it's worthy of judgment. Right now, just for an example of current populations, right now we're told that there's 6.7 billion people on the earth. I'm sorry, to be more specific here, the global population from the year 1800 to the year 2020, just between 1800 and 2020, has grown by 6.7 billion, based upon the growth rate that I already mentioned, the 1.2%. So you can see if it can go from grow by 6.20, how many people could be on the earth, even starting with only 2 people for quite a bit of years, that it would be easy to get up to an enormous number. And so I think what we're seeing here is by this point in time, there is an extreme multitude of people on the planet. Verse 2 basically talks to us about marrying. Verse 2 says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, we're going to deal with the sons of God in verse 2, and we're going to deal with the giants of verse 4. But like I said, we're going to do that after we really understand what we see that's being talked about here, the state of the situation. I think it's important to understand the state of the situation, the state of the earth, because that's a lot of what's the context here that God is telling us. And so we need to understand that. And then next week, or at the end of this week, if we've got time, I really want to delve into specifics as it relates to that. So the sons of God, what do we know about them? They went into the daughters of men, that they were fair. In other words, the daughters of men, they were beautiful. And they took them wives of all which they chose. And so what we're seeing here is when Scripture talks about that they were eating and drinking and marrying before the flood, that's a reference to what was going on here. They were marrying before the flood. Obviously, if they're having nearly 1 billion people, there was marrying and there was children being born. And so one of the questions I think that we can look at here, though, is notice the phrase at the end that it says they took them wives of all which they chose. And there's an interesting point in that, and in the sense that wives in which they chose. If you go back to, as we looked at Seth, we looked at the fact that he was the replacement for, who was it? Abel. He was the replacement for Abel. In other words, that now Seth was going to be the line in which the Messiah, the promised Messiah, that the Lord, that God promised Eve that was going to come from her, and promised Satan that from her was going to be the one that's going to crush his head. And so the question is, and it kind of comes into play in a little bit here, as they took wives of which they chose. Is there some sort of an indication here as we continue to look? And so I present this to you to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Are they taken? Are the people of Seth's lineage now starting to combine with those of Cain's and then mixing up that genealogy, mixing up and in some ways contaminating that. That's one of the positions that are out there that people suggest is actually going on. So if you look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, is back to a reference I was mentioning. Genesis 4:26, and says, "And to Seth, to him also was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord." And one of the questions of that verse is it his lineage, again, the one who's the fulfillment to replace Abel, is this a statement that these are the people, the ones who are actually worshiping the Lord? In other words, Cain's side is obviously forsaken the Lord. Is that the indication here? And so when we see in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, they took of wives which they chose, and we see it within the context of what's going on, is it a possibility that they mixed the line of Seth and Cain, causing basically a breakdown of what Genesis 4:26 tells us, that they were calling upon the name of the Lord? Well, we certainly know that there's a breakdown that takes place, because by the time we see what's going on here, as we're going to see, the imaginations of everybody is evil continually. And so much so that it's through Noah alone that the gods decides to preserve man. And so there's obviously a breakdown between Seth and Noah. So go back to Genesis chapter 6, and we'll pick up in verse 3. Again, if you've got any questions, go ahead and type them in. I'll go ahead and look real quick and see if anybody's got any questions. So doesn't look like anybody does as of yet, so we'll just keep on going. So Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, and this one's going to take a little bit to get through as well. Again, like I said, the sons of God we're going to come back to, so we're not going to skip over that. Verse 3, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." And so here we have the idea of my spirit is not always going to strive with man, and also the idea of 120 years. And really there's three main beliefs out of this 120 years. The first one is that 120 years is atoms, specifically atoms, because in there, apparently in the original language, you have the definite article. And so it literally says the man, meaning a reference to Adam. So one of the beliefs out there is Adam has 120 years remaining. And so I personally don't think that's what it is, but that is one of the belief systems out there. Feel free to study that if you like. The second, and one of the remaining two are pretty popular. The second one is that this 120 years is the lifespan of man, meaning no man is going to live more than 120 years. And that's, I'll be honest with you, that's the position that I used to hold and believe. And I can tell you, as we'll talk about later, but if you've never changed your mind from the things you were taught to the point that you're at right now, then you're not doing enough studying. And you're not doing enough having enough conversations with other people that you're getting challenged. So many people think it's wrong, or that it's you demean yourself if you admit that you were wrong. I think that it shows wisdom. I don't expect to be right about everything, especially early on. And so I used to think that this 120 years was referring to the lifespan of man, and there's a couple of problems with it. When you look at it, the wording, and the reality is that if you look at the wording here, let's look at that. Verse 3, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." And so the wording here is yet his days. And so the idea of it's not so much their age that's being presented here, but how much time he has left. And so the wording would seem to indicate that it's not so much talking about his uppermost age point, but really a reference to how much time there is left. And the other thing is I would point out that the fact of the matter is when's the last time you met somebody who lived to 120? I know that there are those out there I've heard of that's reached 118, and so many, even myself included, would think that was supporting evidence that nobody's going to live more than 120 years. And it's probably a pretty safe bet, but you're not going to get too many people to take that bet because that's pretty obvious. What I think that's actually being said here is it's 120 years equals the time until the flood. And again, this yet his days seems to be an indicator that this is talking about a specific amount of time that is left, not so much his years, but his days left. Not so much how old he is, but like I said, how much time is left. And what do we see that takes place as far as 120 years until the time of the flood? Part of this time, part of this 120 years from, if that's the case, when it says, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days be 120 years. What we see, what takes place over 120 years? Well, we know that part of that time Noah is preaching. Turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. Here we see, it says, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of ungodly. And so we see that at some point in Noah's life, he was certainly a preacher of righteousness. He was preaching. Most assume that that's taking place, especially during the time in which he's building the ark. He's preaching to people. Some would argue that he's not, because it's already he already understands that it's only going to be him and his family. Look at Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, and as it talks about the Noah, Genesis chapter 6, God tells him to build the ark. In verse 13 it says, and God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And so at this point is whenever Noah is actually told. Is there a time difference between, and I think that there is, from whenever God declares, not so much to Noah, when God declares that he is going to destroy the earth. In other words, he's got 120 years left, and then the time in which he tells Noah. Well, we know, what we can tell is that Noah was 500 years old when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were born. And it's important to really look at what it says. Turn back to Genesis chapter 5, verse 32. Genesis 5:32 says, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so was Noah 500 years old whenever he began to have Shem, Ham, and Japheth? I don't think so. I think that we know that these guys aren't triplets. They're not triplets. We know that Japheth was the oldest one. And so I think that what you have is by the time Noah was 500 years old, the youngest one was born. And so we can see a timeline of 500 years old whenever he begat them, whether it's the beginning, the first one, which would have been Japheth, or the last one, which is what I think. But we also know that in Genesis chapter 7, verse 6, that how old Noah was at the flood. And it's 100 years after the events of this verse 32 of chapter 5. So Noah is 600 years. Look at chapter 7, verse 6. We can see that Noah is 600 years old. Genesis chapter 7, verse 6. Now, verse 5, it says, "And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth." And so Noah was 600 years. So it's 100 years from the time Shem, Ham, and Japheth are born. I think that the last one was born between the flood. You got 100 years. And so I think that what you see is God determines 120 years are left until the flood. Noah and all three of his sons are born by the time Noah is 500 years old. And then we see in verse 16 of verse 13 of chapter 6, God tells Noah to build an ark. And so he builds the ark. We talked before about the age of those before Noah, and Adam himself wouldn't have been long gone. Methuselah would still be alive at this point. And so, and again, a lot of people believe that the flood came when Methuselah died on his own natural causes. And so it's interesting to think about who all might have been actually helping Noah build this ark. That would be pretty interesting to know in the future how that all took place. Any questions or anything? Let's see here. Genesis 6:2. Sons of God are the same sons of God that are in Job 1:6. And Frank, again, I think that that's one of the possibilities. That's the one. Are they the angels? In this particular case, in Genesis 6, they would certainly have to be the fallen angels, because obviously the saved angels would go into the daughters of men. And we're going to talk about, again, that a little bit later. I used to believe that. I really did. And then being challenged and taking a look at this. And that's one of the good things about having to teach, is because you're accountable for what you teach, and you have to really go study it, which really made me get in to study this. And so there's some things that I want to explore with you guys. Again, in the end, it's not about you believing what I tell you to. It's about me sharing with you from study what the scriptures are saying, what I believe to be true, and I'm going to always tell you what I believe to be true. And then from there, you make your own decisions. From there, you see if these things be so, and you study it for yourself. And so Frank, we'll explore that. Like I said, it'll probably be next week. And so everybody, bring your study. And again, if we get a chance to talk about it this evening, we will. So, any other comments? And just for those who are wondering, Job 1:6, we'll read that real quick. I'll pull that up. Job 1:6 says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them." Here, obviously, the sons of God would need to be the angels. And so the question then, and here it is, you can do the study or wait until we do it together. Is sons of God only, even in the Old Testament, only ever used of angels? The answer is no. The answer is no. And that's one of the things that changed my mind. Either way, whatever you believe on the sons of God, it doesn't change, and this is the reason why we're not doing it yet. It doesn't change what's going on here. God is judging the unrighteousness and the state of mankind. Why? Because he's going to preserve the line of Christ. He's going to preserve his plan of salvation. That's the case. We know that to be the case. So, all right, back to Genesis here. So as we look at this 120 years, my personal belief is this 120 years, this idea of the Spirit of God is not going to strive with man, and this 120 years is going to be the time until the flood. And I do think that Methuselah comes into play here, and because once he's gone, then the deluge is what's going to come. All right, verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children of them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Um, I'm going to read a few verses here because we're really going to try and break down verses 4 through 8 together again in multiple parts. But verse 5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so, a couple of things I want you to look at. And so, why is it that God is judging the earth? Again, there's the idea that these sons of God have contaminated the line, and so God is going to judge the world. But what it says here is that God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil. And so that is the reason that's actually given. And so that's going to come into play as we talk about the other things. So what I really want to do is what do we know about these mighty men, and what do we know about the situation of man? What do we know about the situation of his heart and this judgment? Well, what we know is there were mighty men, and they were renowned, and they were greatly wicked, apparently, because in verses 5 and 6, these men of renown are the offsprings of these sons of God, whoever they were, angels or they were these mighty men themselves. And so what we do know is the fact that they were greatly wicked, verses 5 and 6, and God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And so the judgment that's going to happen is even these mighty men, their wickedness was great, and that their heart was only evil. And when you look at what that actually what this says, look at verse 5. Let's look at the text. And that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Hebrew word here signifies not only the imagination, but also the purposes and desires of that individual. And here, what God is telling us is that mankind's his heart was only evil, and all his imaginations, all of his purposes, all of his desires were evil continually. That's a pretty bad time. We think it's bad today. But I don't think that it's as bad today as it was then. Every imagination was evil. And so imagine how bad things would be. Look at a few verses here. Look at Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. It says, and the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. And in verse 22, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And so what do we see here? God is pronouncing after the flood that he's never again going to he's never going to destroy all life. And he's acknowledging even from their youth, the imagination of man's heart is evil from youth. And there's plenty more references to the evilness that there is in man. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 3. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 3. So, you know where Psalms and Proverbs is? Ecclesiastes is right after Proverbs. Chapter 9, verse 3. It says, this is an evil among all things that are done under the sun, that there is one event unto all, yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil. and madness is in their heart while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. And so obviously this is written many years later, but um, this this acknowledgement in Genesis chapter 8, verse 21 is that I'm never going to do it again. I'm never going to destroy all the earth again. For man's thoughts are evil from his youth. Many people are familiar with Jeremiah 17:9. Look at there. Just a few books after Ecclesiastes. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Our heart in the flesh is certainly desperately wicked. And so that is the state of mankind today in the flesh. That was the state of mankind when Jeremiah wrote that, and that's the state of mankind in Genesis 8, immediately after the flood, and man began to produce on the earth, and that was the state of mankind apparently before the flood, apart from Noah anyway, as from what we see. And so look at Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 9. Ezekiel chapter 8. So after Jeremiah, you got Lamentations and Ezekiel. So Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 9. And he said unto me, go in and behold the wicked abominations that they do here. Again, the wickedness of mankind, even the nation of Israel, that they've done. Look at verse 12 there of Ezekiel. Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chambers of his imagery? For they say, the Lord seeth us not. The Lord hath forsaken the earth. And so there's this idea that God doesn't see. Look at Matthew 15:19. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. Matthew 15:19. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemy. Where do these imaginations, these ideas, these schemes, these plans, where do they come from? They go back right here where the Lord is talking about that the imaginations of man are evil continually. And so that's the case. Now look at Ephesians chapter 2. We see something that Paul talks about here that I want to look at. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. Talking about us. Talking specifically about Gentiles. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. And you hath he quickened, made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins. For in times past you walked according to the course of this world. Well, what was the course of this world? Well, the course of this world that he's referring to didn't come about with Israel. It didn't come about with the calling of Abraham. It didn't come about after the flood. The course of this world began at whenever Adam sinned. And we see how evil it was here in Genesis chapter 6. And so he's saying you walked, Ephesians 2:2, in times past you walked according to that course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Well, what were these people here in Genesis chapter 6? They were the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. Can't read that with knowing verse 4 is there without reading it. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us. He didn't leave us in that state. He did something about it. So keep in mind that when we think about the harshness of the flood. But so what do we see here? We see that man's heart was evil continually. That's what his thoughts were. That's where his schemes, his plans, his imaginations. That's what it was. And again, the Hebrew there signifies not just imagination. but the purposes and desires that he had. Now, compare that, the picture that we just painted here. Compare that, what we see, which is the state by Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Genesis 1:31. Let's see the difference. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it wasn't just good, it was very good. The evening and the morning were the sixth day. Everything that God had made was very good, and here we get to Genesis chapter 6, and yes, it's been 1,600 years, and you have sin introduced, you have man doing his own ways, and in that 1,600 years, we've gone from everything being very good to everything being very bad. And according to Scripture, with the exception, really, of Noah. And so, and I would obviously assume that would also include Methuselah, whenever. But like I said, he's going to be dead by the time the flood comes itself. And so, just interesting to look at the state from Genesis 1:31 to Genesis chapter 6. So, what do we have during this time period? Well, if you read 1 Peter chapter 3, it says that the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. Specifically says this. You can go look it up, 1 Peter chapter 3. For time's sake, we won't go there. The long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing. So God was being long suffering during this time period because man continued to do evil for those 120 years. He continued to scheme. He continued to do evil. He continued to reject God. And I would say that when you look at Romans chapter 1, where it talks about how when they knew, well, let's just go there. I think I was going to take you there later, but let's just go there. Romans chapter 1. I think that we can see that this is true about the time period in Genesis chapter 6 as well. Look at start at verse 18. Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, we usually talk about Romans 1 in the context, and again, as it talks about the fact that for the glory of God is seen in the heavens. But notice these next few verses. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that, now here's the part I want you to look at. When they knew God, do you think that they knew God by Genesis chapter 6? Like I said, Adam hadn't been dead that long. You're talking the seventh generation between Adam and Noah. 7 generations. Noah would have been talking to Seth, probably, if I remember my timeline. So the fact that they would have known God, which means they decided to reject God. They decided they didn't want to listen to God. They wanted to do just like it says in verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became what? Vain in their imaginations. And their foolish heart was darkened. And we obviously know that is the fulfillment is going to see in that whenever God sets the Gentiles aside and he calls Abram in Genesis chapter 12. But I think that there's truth in this. These verses in Romans 1 as it relates to Genesis chapter 6, because they would have known God in a way that few ever would have. So keep that in mind. But what you have here is the long suffering of God during this time period, and while Noah, during this 120 years, and while Noah is building this ark, God is long suffering. God is literally, again, Noah is a preacher of righteousness. If Noah is preaching during this time period of whenever he's told in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, and God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them from the earth. If this, during this time period, that Noah is preaching to the world, and God is showing all long suffering, and the world continues to scoff and laugh and neglect and ignore, God is certainly long suffering during this time period. And I think that we see the long suffering that even Peter describes whenever he's being questioned by those whom he taught, and he uses the explanation that God is long suffering. Even today, when we think of the evil that's going on in the world, why is it that God is putting off the rapture? Because his desire is for all men to be saved. So now the other thing I want you to keep in mind is this Genesis chapter 6. When you think of dispensations, and if you think of a traditional 7 dispensations, right now this is currently the dispensation of conscience. And so you go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, which let's go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, is we see that man is driven out of the garden. Genesis 3:24 says, so he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, a flaming sword, which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. And so that is the point in when Adam and Eve is driven out of the Garden of Eden, and they go from the time of innocence, the time before sin, to now this time of conscience. And what is the result? People, their imaginations, the things that they conceive are evil. They knew right from wrong. But before we go there, so if Genesis 3:24, we have the end of innocence, and here we begin conscience, when do we see the conscience end? Turn to chapter 8, and we see that in verse 19 is whenever Noah comes out of the ark, one of the things that's going to end up happening is a change. And so Genesis chapter 8, verse 18, and Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth on the earth after their kinds, went forth out of the ark. And in verse 20, what you're seeing is Noah's going to build an altar. He's going to make a sacrifice. In verse 21 is whenever the Lord smells it. And in verses 21 and 22 is whenever he acknowledges that man's imagination from his youth is evil, and he's not going to do it again. Chapter 9 is whenever he blesses Noah and his sons. And then after this, right then, is whenever God institutes a human government, being the third time in which God is working with man in a different way. So during this time in Genesis chapter 6, from Genesis 3 to Genesis 8 and 9, basically you have the dispensation of conscience. You see, if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, we find that God or man knew right from wrong. And so, and that's exactly what, look at Genesis 3:22. That's exactly what it says. There we go. Genesis 3:22. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the God sent him out of the garden. So man, whenever he does sin, he knows good and evil. And obviously, it's not referring knowing simply as, but it is talking about as also knowledge of. But this idea of know really means experienced. So man has experienced good already, but now he's experienced evil. And we can use the Bible to help us understand that. When the scriptures talk about when a husband takes a wife and they come together to have children, it doesn't describe things in a vulgar manner. How does it, what's the phrase? That he knew his wife. And so Here, what we're seeing in Genesis chapter 3, they experienced evil. And so now they have the knowledge and experience of both good and evil. And what's the result of that? They choose the evil. Their imaginations are all evil continuously. So they knew right from wrong. But God saw the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth, and that every imagination, what it says, of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Man had experienced evil and now chooses to do evil continually. And so, again, this is the dispensation of conscience that we're seeing that will end with the institution of human government, and new things will be put into place. You want to know where the idea of human government came from? It didn't come in the sense of a righteous man has probably always had some sort of unlawful human government. Whenever Cain has his son and they make a city, I'm sure there was some sort of a government. But here is when God, in Genesis chapter 9, God establishes and basically he ordains human government. He allows it. He gives human government the right to do things, which would include the death penalty, which would include a number of different things. And so when Noah leaves the ark, God institutes human government. Later you see the dispensation of promise, and that is when God calls Abram and makes promises, makes a covenant with him. And what is the result of that? Is that in itself enough to cause man to do good? No. I mean, think of it like this. You think of parents who always use positive reinforcement. They don't want to spank their children. They only want to do positive things. Well, think of the dispensation of promise much like that. God wasn't um, going to judge the whole earth again. And so God makes a promise. What's the result? Mankind still fails. God institutes the law with Moses. Does that fix the problem? Now that man can see what is sin and know exactly what it is, does that fix it? No, that doesn't fix it either. What does God do? He institutes this day of grace. What is the point? All of these time periods are showing from one stage to the next man's reliance on God. And it also shows God's faithfulness, that he has a plan and he's going to take us from point A to point B. So this period in particular, this Genesis chapter 6, Noah's flood, is going to end with a change from conscience to God, like I said, installing human government. Let me see if there's any questions. Tim says, Ecclesiastes 9:3 says, son of men, not sons of God. I wasn't referring to that as a reference to the sons of God. So Ecclesiastes 9:3 wasn't, and let me go back there again. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 3. This is an evil among all the things that are done under the sun, that there is one event unto all, yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil. The point wasn't comparing sons of men and showing that sons of God are the sons of men here. That wasn't the point. The sons of God we're dealing with later. The point in which I was using was that mankind was full of evil and madness is in their heart. Going back to the idea of what Genesis 6:5 was talking about. Genesis 6:5, and God saw the wickedness of man was great. So when I bring up Ecclesiastes 9:3, it's not in comparing sons of God and sons of men. It's showing the state of mankind, that mankind's heart is evil. And that is, we see that in Genesis 6:5, and we see that in Ecclesiastes 9:3. So I hope that clears up the reason why I brought that up. For those on Facebook, Steve Kids over on YouTube, he says hello. And so again, back to Genesis chapter 6, as we get close to finishing up for the evening. What do we see that's going on here? We see that that there is evilness that's taking place, and God says that in 120 years, that 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 God is going to judge that God is going to judge the earth. You're welcome, Tim. And so, and then what do we have? We have that the evilness, the reason for it. And so God gets to the point in verse 6, he says he repented. And again, repentant isn't acknowledging sin. It's not asking for forgiveness of sin. That's not what repentant is. And so we'll deal with that. God repents, and then the sons of God and the giants next week, as I figured. There was just no way we were going to get get through all of this and give justification to the different opinions for this. Like I said, I've changed my position, and that doesn't mean I won't change it again. That's one of the things about being a student of the Bible, is making sure that you continue to be a student and study, and we'll look at that next week. And what we'll see is that God judges man for righteous reasons. And so, any other questions before we call it an evening? Okay. Well, you guys have a good evening. Again, next week we'll do really part 2 of this, and deal specifically with the sons of God, the giants. And again, if you want to do some study prep, you can go look up the sons of God, this phrase, and the fact that it is not only, or it's not exclusively used of angels. And so we can see its use in other places. And so we'll look, like I said, at those different opinions next week. So.